Welcome to Big Sky Mysteries. As I am in the midst of a conference for work, working on implementing a new POS to replace the previous POS POS, and all that entails, this episode is a compilation of some of the latest narrations from the past few months. Thank you for your patience and your patronage. If you like terrifying tales and have not done so already, please hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell so you make sure not to miss a single scare. Now, enjoy. My Mother Didn't Like Me Much by Chad Austin. Writer's note. I don't know if trigger warnings are a big deal here, but I thought I'd give one. Anyone sensitive to suicide in the family. My mother and I never really got along. Don't get me wrong. She made an effort to appear that she loved me, but she always kept me at arm's length. I tried my hardest to impress her, to please her, but there was always this sense of mistrust in her eyes. She seemed so sad when she looked at me. As much as I tried, I never could break through the layer of ice she put between us. My father did his best to make up for it, but he was only one man. Nothing can take the place of a mother. They said it was a form of paranoid schizophrenia. At least that's what little I gathered when I was younger. They tried to keep as much of it from me as possible. It was probably so I didn't blame myself. But children are instinctively curious creatures. Adults tend to underestimate kids, and I like to think I was smarter than they gave me credit for. I knew those months she spent in the hospital weren't because she was sick, at least not in the physical sense. The bars on the windows were too thick to just keep out drafts. My father took me to see her for the first couple of days. The doctors eventually forbade him from doing so. It's not like I minded, though. She would yell upsetting things every time I entered the room and wouldn't stop until I left. She screamed that I wasn't her son, that she hated me, that I was a monster. You can imagine how I felt hearing this as a child, coming from someone who was meant to love and cherish you. However, I knew it wasn't really her screaming those things at me. She was my mother no matter what. I suppose that's why I never hated her for it. It wasn't her fault that she felt that way towards me. Hell, she even tried her best to fight it. I guess that meant she really did love me after all, right? And really, who would I be to talk? If she was crazy, then I wasn't far off. I suffered from my own neurological disorder about the time of my mother's breakdown. Transient global amnesia, they called it. Maybe with some mild dissociative disorder thrown in for good measure. One morning when I was 8, I woke with no memory of my past life. I remembered my mother and father, friends, family, and even where I lived. But I couldn't recall a day of my life prior to the moment I woke up. But I knew it had to be something wrong with me, especially after all my mother had gone through. It could be hereditary for all I know. My parents and I rarely saw each other after I moved away for college, but my father and I talked frequently over the phone. So, when I received the call from him telling me my mother was dead, I was more shocked than saddened. She'd committed suicide the night before. As I collapsed into a chair, my father told me of how he'd found her hanging in the basement that morning when he noticed she hadn't come to bed. She had been there all night, and beside the chair she used was a tear-stained note addressed to me. "I'm so sorry, Jamie. Wherever you are, I should have believed my own eyes. I abandoned you. Can you ever forgive me?" I can't put into words how I felt at that moment. The sudden loss, coupled with the haunting apology she'd left, threatened to destroy me then and there. My head spun and I nearly fainted entirely before the end of the call. I could barely function for the rest of the day. And if it wasn't for my fiancée, Allie, I might have fallen apart completely. She was an angel of mercy. She deserves so much better than me. I was glad that my mother's funeral was scheduled for that week, since I couldn't imagine stretching this ordeal out over a longer period of time. Though Allie wanted to come with me, I thought it best that I go alone. Perhaps it was out of pride that I didn't want to burden her further. Truthfully, it was more likely out of shame than anything else. Airing your family's dirty laundry in front of someone you care about is a worrying prospect. She had to work anyway, and we couldn't afford to miss a paycheck with something as expensive as a wedding looming on the horizon. The funeral was a rather simple affair, tasteful and befitting a woman of my mother's status. Our family's old church was packed to the rafters with grieving family members and friends, and my uncle read her eulogy with tears in his eyes. It was reassuring to know that she was surrounded by so many loved ones that day. I'm not ashamed to admit that my eyes were red and my cheeks were wet by the end. The sun had gone down by the time the wake was over, so I followed my father home. I'd already decided that I would stay a few days with him to help with Mom's affairs. To be honest, I was more worried about how he was holding up during all this, but I apparently hadn't given him enough credit. He was always the stoic type, and not even losing the love of his life was going to destroy him. I still smile when I think of the two of us sitting in the den with cups of coffee chased with scotch, laughing about the time our 80-year-old neighbor chased me through his yard with a weed whacker. Unfortunately, our conversation took a more somber turn as the night rolled in. I had casually put my feet up on a cardboard box left haphazardly next to my chair when my father's expression darkened a bit. "You might not want to put your feet up on that, kid. It's a bit fragile," he scolded me with a slight dip in the jovialness we shared. I gave him a curious look before turning a glance to the box itself. It was rather old, with fading lettering on the side reading "Family Movies" in smudged permanent marker. It smelled musty, like that familiar odor unique to every basement in the known universe. I looked back at him with a smirk and retorted, "Getting sentimental, old man? Trying to remember a day when you still had color in your beard?" Dad stroked his aforementioned graying beard with a thoughtful expression. I thought it was odd that he didn't immediately come back with a snap of his own. "Actually, it was your mother that dragged those old tapes out a couple of weeks ago. She used to record everything you did with that silly camcorder I got her. I mean, until, well, you know." I didn't know for sure, but I had an idea. "Until she lost it, you mean?" My father nodded with a grimace. I knew I was being a bit harsh, but the events of the past week had left me a little numb to it all. "Capgrass delusion. Not sure if we ever told you. Not that it makes much of a difference, really." He sighed heavily, leaning back in his seat. "She really did love that thing. Took it with her everywhere she went. I swore she was going to be a Hollywood director or something one day. I wish she'd kept up with it after her breakdown. It might have helped." The conversation eventually drifted off to other subjects, but I couldn't stop thinking about the videos. It seemed like such a passion of Mom's, like she left these tapes behind specifically for me to watch. Or perhaps it was my own ego wishing she had. Then there was the fact that I still don't remember a thing that happened before I was 8, and my mother had documented our lives up to the point on video. Maybe watching them might help me remember what I'd forgotten. Either way, I knew I had to watch them. When Dad finally decided to go to bed, I wished him a good night and took the musty box of videotapes upstairs. The guest room had been made up for me that day, and even in its current state, it gave me a sense of nostalgia. Before I moved out, it had been my room. However, my parents had the good taste to take down all my cringe-worthy anime posters and angsty teenage memorabilia and turn it into a respectable guest room. Thankfully, they had kept my old TV, which had a VHS player, hooked up to it. I smiled at the quaintness of such an ancient, useless piece of equipment still in working order. As far as I knew, it was the only working cassette player in the world, and I was glad to have it. Opening the box was like unsealing an Egyptian sarcophagus with far less impressive results. A puff of dry dust filled the air, and a smell like wet socks assailed my nostrils. Inside was a small stack of black cassette tapes, all labeled, and a small Panasonic video camera circa 1986. I greedily dug through the tapes, reading labels like Jamie's first birthday and Family Day at the Aquarium with accompanying dates. I finally decided to start with Jamie's birth, 3/3/1988. However, when I tried to put the VHS into the player, I noticed there was already a tape in it. A small chill ran up my spine. My mother had been watching old family videos leading up to her suicide, and this was the only player in the house. Could this be the last ones she watched? It was a pretty morbid thought that this could be the last memory my mother experienced before killing herself. I could feel my skin prickle with goosebumps as I hit the eject button and looked at the cassette's label. It once had writing on it, but someone had furiously scribbled it out with a black marker. It was difficult to make out anything, but I thought I could see the year 1996 written in underneath the black ink. The label seemed rather odd, but I couldn't explain why I felt so apprehensive at that moment, and why the year 1996 seemed so familiar. With a shrug, I placed the cassette into the player and rewound the tape. My finger hovered over the play button for a moment before apprehensively pushing it. The screen flashed to life with a short burst of static before an image appeared on the screen. The scene that illuminated on the television screen was encompassed by a familiar white window frame in pitch darkness. It was obviously the middle of the night. Outside the window was a pretty standard front yard with a metal fence and hedges, much like the ones outside the house I was in. In fact, they were the exact same bushes, albeit several decades younger. From the position of the window, I could tell that it was the window of my old room. The timestamp read 6/12/1996. The shot held on the screen for over a minute, and at first I couldn't see what was important enough to warrant this much attention. It was subtle, but after a few moments, I thought I saw something odd between the trees in our neighbor's yard. It was too dark to make out any real detail, but I saw what looked like a featureless white mask suspended in the pitch darkness. Probably the only reason why I assumed it was a mask were the two black dots where the eyes should be. I didn't have much time to examine the mask in any great detail before the screen went white with digital snow. I'm a little ashamed to say that I jumped in fright as static issued from the speakers and the image was quickly replaced with another. I recognized the location far quicker this time. The camera was angled downward, but I could still make out the old hardwood stairs of my childhood home. Whoever was filming was cautiously descending one step at a time with heavy, controlled breaths. It made some level of sense because it appeared to be nighttime again, and they probably didn't want to wake anyone up. However, the strangeness of the entire scene did make me a bit nervous. When the person holding the camera reached the ground floor, they turned right into a long hallway that ran from one end of the house to the other. I never liked that hallway myself. You could never see the end of it at night, and it felt like staring into a black hole without the lights on. As they turned, they let out an audible gasp and took a step back. With a shaky hand, they lifted the camera to reveal a pitch-black hallway that most certainly was not empty. The poor lighting and even poorer film quality made it difficult to make out precise details, but I could trace a silhouette in the inky pool of darkness. Someone else was in the house, and it was obvious they didn't belong. The outline looked human enough, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms and legs seemed too long and too thin, covered in what must have been a large furry overcoat that dragged on the floor. The intruder appeared to be crouching at the other end of the hallway, but by some trick of the camera, its head looked as if it was still inches from touching the ceiling. That couldn't be right. That would mean the intruder was over 8 feet tall. I suppose I was a bit too enthralled by its form to notice the thing move. After a time, the shapeless form that was most likely its head lifted to reveal an amorphous white object beneath a long curtain of jet black hair. Sweat began to bead on my forehead. Was that a mask? 2 black holes for eyes and a gaping chasm that could be a mouth. What looked to be a pained expression knitted in the milky white brow. It was an odd enough sight on its own, but why was the intruder wearing it upside down? I couldn't tear my eyes from the nightmarish scene. I couldn't even blink out of fear of it bursting through the television screen at me. The room around me faded away, and my entire world became those 1,000 pixels of darkness separated from me by a thin glass screen. There was a sudden fright building in my chest that normal fear could not explain away. There was something else to it. Something much worse. Something like familiarity. A sudden and sharp shriek from the speakers broke me from my trance. I just barely stopped from screaming myself as I snapped back to reality. I'd recognized the voice that came out from the TV. I was sure that it was my mother's, leaving me no doubt who had been filming this insanity. It was clear by the rushing images on screen that the camera swung helplessly at her side as my mother ran away from the thing at the other end of the hallway. Moments later, familiar static filled the screen. I covered my face with my hands and let the sound from the speakers calm my nerves. I felt exhausted. How had I let a video work me up so much? Sure, that thing was creepier than a dozen Pennywises with a heaping helping of Slender Man on the side, but chances were good that it was just some jerk covered in a fur rug and cheap Halloween mask. But then, I suppose it wasn't what it looked like that really scared me. I recognized that upside-down mask. At least I thought I had. I couldn't place it anywhere at first. Then it hit me. Could it have been from before my amnesia? Before that morning I lost my memories and my mother lost her mind? Could this person have something to do with me losing my memories? In the end, the questions outnumbered the answers, and all I was left with was a headache. Fortunately for my growing migraine, I wouldn't have much time to think on the matter. A minute hadn't passed before the sound of static abruptly stopped, and the screen's glow showed an image I hadn't seen in over 5 years. How could I ever forget those pale blue eyes shining from behind a curtain of untamable curly brown hair? Her features may have had 2 or 3 decades worth of wear, but a child could never forget the face of their mother even after all that time. I had to look away when I felt something wet roll down my cheek. I wasn't even aware I'd started crying. My mother stared intently into the camera as she appeared to be fiddling with something on the case. I could see nothing else of the room she was in until she pulled back, evidently satisfied with her work. Even then, I could make out very little. The darkness around her held suggestions of a closet, and what looked to be a bed behind her only bolstered the assumption. As she sat before the camera performing a last-minute inspection of the equipment, I pondered over the strangeness of the scene. Why would my mother hide a camera in a closet? Did this have something to do with the odd intruder? Was she spying on someone? I had an idea, but I really shouldn't have doubted myself in the first place. After a time, a sound from behind my mother confirmed my suspicions. "What are you doing, Mommy?" asked a lazy, childish voice from the bed behind her. The voice was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, like hearing your own voice played through a megaphone. My mother quickly concealed the camera with a blanket and turned a worried smile to the speaker. Across the room, I could see the sleepy face of a much younger me sitting in bed. I'd recognize that dopey bowl cut and those ugly G.I. Joe pajamas anywhere. For one beautiful moment, I'd forgotten the past week and actually smiled. "Nothing, baby," came my mother's voice, comforting and confident. I couldn't remember her ever speaking to me like she did in that moment. "I'm just putting away your toys. Lie down, okay?" Standing to her full height, she then moved to the bed and kissed me on the forehead. Then she was at the light switch, turning it off and closing my door with a soft, "Good night, baby." And that was it. Mom left and I went to sleep. It was such a surreal experience watching such a mundane event after watching a carnival of horrors in a scream mask terrorize my mother. It felt a bit anticlimactic ending here. I knew there was no way I was going to watch myself get a good night's rest, not after what I'd just watched. Every worst case scenario I could think of ran through my head at that moment. It was a waking nightmare, made worse by the fact that the nightmare already happened. I considered turning off the VHS then and there. I weighed the benefits of knowing and not knowing, but it was clear from the start that I couldn't go on without finding out what had happened that night. My thumb quavered over the fast forward button before pressing it and setting the video to 4 times normal speed. Even with the increase in speed, watching my younger self toss and turn in his sleep was agony. I couldn't keep my mind from wandering to less pleasant outcomes. I tried to focus on watching the shadows cast on the floor by the curtains and solitary tree outside my second-floor window, but my eyes were drawn to the darkness beneath my bed. I was so sure some monster was about to reach out from the void and pull me below. 1 a.m. passed, and I stared at the door, sure a murderer was about to enter with a knife. 2 a.m. passed, and I watched the closet, expecting a giant snake to slither past. Then 3 a.m. passed, and I pressed play. The video returned to normal speed, and I watched with a newly feverish intensity. For a moment, I wasn't even certain why I stopped there, but as I focused on the screen, it became fiendishly clear. Until now, the shadow cast across my bedroom floor by the curtains had been calm and motionless. Now, they waved in the air, as if a wind guided them, as if the window had been opened. The shadow on the floor twisted into an amorphous mass that I could not define, moving with an alien purpose I could not even begin to imagine. It entered through the window and strode across my bedroom floor on those impossibly long and disgustingly thin legs. It was so tall, it had to crouch to avoid hitting the ceiling. That damned, upside-down masked face never looked away from my sleeping form. In its gangly arms, it held something I could not see, though it seemed to support with this unknown parcel with an almost mother-like air. Knowing that this unearthly-looking creep had once stood over me as I slept made bile rise in my throat. As I stared at its disgusting fur-covered form, I wondered how I could have assumed it was human in the first place. Its limbs were too long and thin, and its height was nothing short of monstrous. Even that strange white mask seemed to twitch as if it was really a face. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me, but at that moment, I was sure the thing that loomed over me was nothing natural. The creature's hand extended towards my sleeping form. Delicately thin fingers wrapped around my small body, and it was odd how I did not wake. I didn't make a sound as the thing lifted me out of bed and held me to its chest. I looked dead in its grip, increasing the strangeness of the entire image. I was so distracted by my reaction that I nearly missed the bundle it held in its free hand. The monster lowered its burden to my bed and covered it in my blankets. At this angle, it was impossible to see just what it was it left in my place. My heart nearly beat out of my chest as the thing turned away from my bed with its new prize cradled in its arms. It slunk back the way it had come, with slow, measured steps of its emaciated limbs. But as it neared the edge of the frame, it hesitated a moment. The sudden halt caused me to gasp audibly, and as if it had heard me, the creature turned its head towards the camera. For a moment, it simply stared into my eyes. Then, as if in slow motion, the grotesque mask's jaw unhinged, and there arose the most nightmarishly distorted screech I've ever heard from the television speakers. I had to clap my hands to my ears in fear that it would burst my eardrums. I think I screamed myself as the creature's face stretched to inhuman proportions. It was a mercy when I heard its screech replaced by the soothing sound of static once more. I can't even begin to describe the condition the video had left me. At no point did I notice I was sweating, but the perspiration had soaked through my shirt. My muscles had tensed so tightly that I now felt sore and achy from head to toe. I was mentally drained, and I could only tackle the questions that plagued with feeble exhaustion. How could this be real? There was no way this tape could have been faked, not with my mother and I both playing unwitting parts in this ghastly reproduction. But what else could explain it? What could explain an 8-foot-tall monstrosity that stole children in the night? Did this thing have anything to do with my mother's death? Or even more pressing, could this midnight transient have anything to do with my childhood amnesia? That thought frightened me more than anything else, but as I said, I lacked the energy to even consider an answer. I'm not sure how long I sat there in a pool of my own sweat, gripping the edge of the bed until my knuckles turned blue. I'm not even sure I gave a damn. I could sit in a trance listening to the digital snow for the rest of my life for all I cared. But it was obvious the tape was not done with me. Whatever that amorphous creature did to cut the camera's feed had obviously worked rather well. The first thing I saw on screen after the static cleared was my young mother's face lit by the early rays of a morning sun. For a moment, I felt safe again, like I was wrapped in a warm blanket on a cold winter's day. Seeing my mother's face reminded me that not everything in the world was a waking nightmare. I think I smiled a little as I watched her busy herself with the camera. Who could blame me for my sentimentality after all I'd seen? That moment of self-indulgence was the last time I felt like a man. It was the last moment of comfort I will ever feel. In those last few seconds, I could see the purest form of love and concern for a woman's child. Some days, that's the only thing that keeps me going. Even though I know that her love wasn't truly meant for me. She was in the closet again, fussing over the camera she found switched off. It must have frightened her to find it in the state it was in. She had no idea what the thing had done that night, and had no idea what horrors could be waiting for her underneath the covers of her child's bed. I think that was the worst part. Not knowing just what that monster had left in my place. My moment of dreadful contemplation was broken, however, by a soft rustle from behind my mother. I could hear it, but my mother apparently did not. She only turned when she heard the thing speak. The sound of its voice made me gag. I had to slap a hand to my mouth to keep from vomiting. It wasn't its apparent grotesqueness that sickened me. It was its familiarity. The message was very simple. It simply said, "Mommy, what are you doing?" But it spoke in my voice, and when she turned to address it, it looked at her with my face. I haven't been back to my parents' house since that horrible night, but I try to keep up with my father as much as I can. I'm all he has left, after all. It's been difficult, however. These thoughts will not leave me be, and I found it hard to keep a job. Not even my dreams are safe from them, as I've found it easier to just avoid sleep altogether when I can. Allie left me yesterday, and I think it is for the best. I always knew she deserved better than me, and I finally know why. Even now, I can't help but dwell on the implications of that night. Can I truthfully say that I am the boy who fell asleep that night, and not some poor imitation in the arms of a night-haunting monstrosity? If I was honest with myself, I'd wonder why the real me would not remember a day before that moonlit visit from a nightmare. But then, what does that make me? Am I just like that thing who stole my doppelganger in the middle of the night? Or perhaps I was stolen from another world and exchanged in this one. The worst thing about it all is just how useless these questions are, since I am no closer to an answer than the day I first asked them. I've began to dream about him now. That thing that brought me here. He perches himself over my bed as I sleep. That pale, upside-down face, framed in matted black hair, only watched me at first. As the dreams became more frequent, the black creature began to speak to me, but I could not understand the words. They came to me as whispers in languages I'd never heard before, yet they still seemed familiar. Though I don't understand what he says, I do not believe he means me any harm. However, he still fills me with unbearable dread, for I know what he wants. You see, he plans to return for me. He always has. And when he does, God only knows to what horrors he will draw me. I don't blame my mother, if I can still call her that, not for how she treated me. Her rage came from the sense of failure she had for not believing her own eyes, for not saving her son. I could never imagine how that must have felt. There's a great many things about this whole ordeal that I do not understand. But there is one thing I know for sure. That note my mother left the night she killed herself wasn't meant for me. The Thing I Saw the Day My Friend Died by sethraziel. This happened years ago, but it is still something that sticks with me. This all happened like a sequence. You never know if things are supposed to happen for a reason, or if some unknown outside force influences it. But first, backstory. My friend, let's call her Jenny, was a cheery, happy-go-lucky young woman. She rode one of them crotch rocket bikes and loved riding it. Always up for new and exciting things, she took a job as a security guard for a casino I worked at. She was always that ray of sunshine that would bring you up if you were having a bad day. Even when she was feeling down, she always made it a point to make sure you were feeling better. After a year, she was promoted to a gaming officer. She was really happy as this was an entry point to get into the upstairs offices. She would tell me often that if she got in, she would try to get me in with her. I worked on the floor, paying out jackpots and getting change for gamers. Not long after her promotion, she started acting funny. Not so much that people noticed it right away, but enough that I noticed it. She would come to work tired or come late, but never said why. I noticed her attitude change as well. She was more jumpy and cautious than normal. One time during a conversation we were having on the floor, she stopped and just, as I first thought, stared at me. I realized after a little bit that she wasn't staring at me, but behind me. I turned but saw nothing. She seemed to snap out of it after a bit and brushed it off as losing her track of thought. I never questioned it at the time. One day, she came in 2 hours late. Her superior wasn't too happy. He had actually sought me out on the floor to see if I could get a hold of her. When she did come in, she looked worse for wear. She was unkempt, baggy red eyes, and jittery. When questioned by her superior, she put it as a late night out. When she came to the floor, she pulled me aside and asked to meet up after work. We met at Denny's and she proceeded to tell me what was going on. She, as she put it, was having weird crap happen to her. It started subtly at first. A chill here, a noise there. Nothing she couldn't explain away. But as time progressed, things got weirder. The chills got colder. The noises got louder and more frequent. Things were never where she left them. Then it started happening at work. Her desk was always rearranged from how she left it. She thought that someone was messing with her, even voicing her concern, but nobody ever came forward. When she was walking the floor, she would feel a tap on her shoulder or a tug on her shirt, with nobody around. When she would walk to her office, which was located near the uniform room in a less trafficked area of the building, she always heard footsteps in line with hers, as if somebody was walking right behind her. She was afraid to use the restrooms as well, if no one was with her. It was there, one day she said, she got scared real bad. Answering the call of nature, she had just begun when she said there was a single light knock on the stall door. She had announced herself in the stall when someone knocked again, this time 2 of them, louder than the first. She had said she was using it and to use another when the door began to rattle as if someone was jiggling the handle. Then it stopped. She said she was about to get up when, to her horror, the sliding lock began to slowly move, unlocking itself. Jenny said she flung the door open. no one was there. When she got out of the stall, no one was in there. She was about to walk out when, turning towards the stalls, she said she saw a dark mass, humanoid looking, peeking out behind the furthest stall. She said she had seen it often since. The day she was really late, she said she was awoken from her sleep. It was night, her room was dark, and she couldn't speak nor move. She tried to, she told me, but couldn't. She had a dreaded feeling like she wasn't alone. The only thing she could move was her eyes, she recalled, and she happened to look up with them, seeing this humanoid mass looking right down at her. A faint glow where eyes would be. She said she closed her eyes and was able to scream, finally gaining control of her body. She jumped out of bed and tried to turn on the light near her bed, but it wouldn't work. The mass then started to come towards her, blocking her bedroom door. She said she ran into the closet and shut it. The light in the closet worked. She said she was afraid of opening the door. She heard it moving around the room. She fell asleep in there, not waking till late in the morning, got quickly dressed and came in, hence her appearance. The last week of her life, she stayed with me. Despite the odd occurrences at work, nothing ever happened at my place. She was peaceful. She was sleeping and eating again, and on her days off, she reported nothing happening. The day she died was one of the strangest and scariest days of my life. It started with me going in like normal. I came in at 8 and Jenny came in an hour later. Things were pretty normal, and at 12 we went to lunch. During lunch, she told me she was going to go back to her place. The last week was pretty good, and she hoped that whatever it was had finally left her alone. After that, we went back to our posts. About half hour after lunch, my supervisor calls me in the office and says one of the swing shift people called out and asked if I could pull a double. If I agreed, I could take the next day off or come in and get the overtime, so I agreed. At around the same time, Jenny was asked to stay a few hours more as one of her coworkers had suddenly gotten ill in the stomach and had to go, so she agreed. After that, I got the strangest feeling like I was being watched. Couldn't explain it. I just felt someone was staring at me in empty parts of the floor. Jenny told me she started to feel like a weight was being lifted off her, but she also felt like I was in trouble somehow. She said something in the back of her head said that someone was mad at me, like they hated me. But she didn't know who, nor could she explain why it was that specific feeling. My second shift started, and her extra hours started like this. Some of my coworkers reported feeling uneasy around me, while Jenny's said that she was becoming like her old self again. When Jenny was getting ready to end her shift at 11 in the evening that night, I took my final break to say goodbye, as I was getting out an hour after her. She said she felt free in what seemed like forever. She wanted to enjoy her ride home. She said she would text me when she made it. We hugged, and I saw her off for what would be the last time. Needing to go back on the floor, I had the call of nature beckoning me, but decided I could hold it. Or so I thought. As I was making my rounds, that urge came at me strong, literally forcing me to make a mad rush to the employee restroom. I ran in and got the nearest urinal, relieved. I washed my hands and started to leave when a light, soft knock came from the direction of the stalls. There, peeking out from the farthest stall, was a black mass, humanoid looking with a soft glow where the eyes should be. I blinked and it was gone. I stood frozen there, literally trying to rationalize if I saw something or not. I looked at the time on my phone. 20 minutes had passed since Jenny left. I looked up, and there it was again, only this time, I got this really bad feeling that something was wrong and I bolted out of there. That image was burned into my memory and has been ever since. I called Jenny, but it went to voicemail. I finished the rest of my shift with that dreaded feeling. After work, I went home and tried calling again. Voicemail. I left her a message to get back at me ASAP. That feeling stayed with me till I fell asleep. My sister broke the news to me that morning. Her boyfriend was an EMT that responded to an accident call. He, Jenny, and I, as well as my sister, had all gone to high school together. Being the one that took the call, he was shocked to find her off the road, about 40 feet to be exact, dead, with a broken neck. She had hit the safeguard, this metal piece that curved with the road. He thought it weird that she would have landed 40 feet away, seeing that the speed limit at the turn was only 20, and that later it was determined that she hit it going 10 miles an hour. No alcohol nor drugs were found in her system, so they thought that she had probably fell asleep, and when she hit, she landed neck first and slid to a halt. Though I was later told by my sister's boyfriend that when he got there, he didn't see anything that looked like she had slid. The ground, he remembered, was undisturbed. This has haunted me for a while now. A few weeks ago, I dreamt Jenny was talking to me. I couldn't hear her, and she had this blank, almost emotionless expression. She then points behind me, and there it is. The thing I saw the day my friend died. I am by no means an artist or a painter. Hell, I can hardly draw. But after that dream, I tried to depict what I saw in that restroom all those years ago. This is the closest I've gotten to it. One more thing I forgot to mention. When the time of death was given, it was around 11:20 p.m., about the same time I saw that thing. Update. It has been years since I've been in that casino. I recently went back to my hometown where it's located and caught up with old friends who still work there. Apparently, that thing is following another friend of mine like it did Jenny. My friend suffered a nervous breakdown during his shift. The girl I spoke to said he was acting weirder than normal, culminating in his screaming and ranting about the shadow that won't leave him alone. Only a close few people know about what Jenny went through and what I experienced, and the girl I spoke to was one of them. She mentioned that other things have been happening. My brother, who started security there a few years ago, mentioned something creepy he once witnessed. The security team usually have a driver who drives around the property to make sure the parking areas and back part of the casino is safe. Behind the casino are these dumpster areas that the food and beverage and custodial teams use. Well, my brother tells me that one night he went on break. There is a patio area outside that employees use to sit outside or to smoke. There is a wall around it, but on the other side is the dumpsters. He goes to the patio with one of the food and beverage girls to smoke. During this time, they hear faint crying. At the same time, over his radio, he hears the truck driver calling in a female he spots crying in the corner of the dumpsters. He says the driver describes her as short, long dark hair, blue sweater, and jeans with no shoes on. She's crouched in the corner back to him, sobbing, as he said, loud. My brother, of course, being on the opposite side of the wall, can barely hear crying. Well, he then says the driver calls it in to surveillance. There are 2 cameras that point in that direction, one seeing that particular corner very well. After he calls it in, surveillance gets back to him asking what he's talking about. This is how he put it. Surveillance: "What are you calling in again?" Driver: "A female in the corner of the dumpsters crying. She's not responding to my calls." Surveillance: "Okay, we see you, we don't see a girl." Driver: "What do you mean? She's right there in front of me." Surveillance: "No, sir. All we see is you, no one else." Driver: "Are you serious? You really don't see the girl right here?" Surveillance: "No, sir. If you are joking, then it's a bad one, not to mention a waste of our time." That's about the time my brother says the crying stopped, followed by a shriek from the driver and him burning rubber out of there. My brother went on to say that the driver was visibly shaken and trembling. When pressed by his supervisor about what happened, he related that after surveillance said she wasn't there, she stopped crying and stood up, her hair falling back like it had no neck bones, and then started walking towards him, but backwards, with her head dangling side to side. He shrieked and got out of there. What was disturbing as well to my brother was that later, the driver said that when her head fell back, it had no face. I must say some creepy crap is going on there. I wonder though, the way he described the girl, I wonder if it was Jenny. Even though she didn't die at the casino, I wonder if that thing is keeping her trapped there. Night Shift in a Care Home by BeardedBamboozle. I recently found some Let's Read type channels on YouTube and decided to try and write down an experience I had a few years ago, as it seemed similar to the content being posted. I'm 27 years old, male, live in the UK with my fiance, and currently work as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special educational needs in a school not far from Bradgate Park in Leicestershire. I have worked in a number of schools and children's homes now, and these buildings, especially the children's home, are usually old, renovated houses or halls. This particular story happened in 2013 when I had just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults, 18 to 30 years old, with autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked in was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a games room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house and activity home that led on to acres of fields and woodland. I had been working there for about 3 weeks and primarily worked the waking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all of the residents were settled for the night and to get the cleaning done before the day staff came in to take over. I would usually get all of my jobs done around 1 a.m. and spend the rest of the night listening out for anyone that woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course books, or sometimes just play games on my phone once I finished. The residents usually slept all night. On one particular night, a young man named James, not the actual name for legal reasons, was particularly restless. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him when he got into one of his bad moods, and the slightest thing could set him off. He once threw a member of the staff through a patio door because she had forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences and would communicate with fairly simple words put together in a way that he understood. For example, he would say something like, "James, make breakfast," when he was ready to make breakfast, or "James, go outside," if he wanted to go outside and play. He was generally well behaved and could be quite funny when he wanted to, but was well known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself, and he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye on his door for maybe 15 minutes or so to make sure he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he had settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James's bedroom was a communal living room with board games, a TV, sofa, books, and stuff like that. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something heavy drop onto the floor in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went upstairs and knocked on his door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm and his eyes looked almost half shut like he had been asleep. I asked if he was okay, and he said yes and put his thumb up. This was something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out, so I left him to it and told him to be careful, thinking he had knocked something over. An hour or so passed, and by now I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another bang above me, again like something had been dropped. This time, I realized that the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house was set up to house 5 residents, but there were only currently 4, and the room above me was the spare, empty room. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everyone was asleep. Due to the nature of their conditions and behaviors, each resident has an alarm fitted to their door that is activated at night, so if anyone leaves their room, a small receiver box that the night staff carry around makes a noise and a light blinks for a few seconds to indicate which door had been opened, numbered 1 through 5. The alarm had not gone off, so I knew that the noise was not from any of the residents. I got back to my cleaning and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following night, I got to work just before 10, and as I entered the hallway, I could tell that something was wrong. James was at the bottom of the stairs, covering his ears and humming loudly, and 3 members of staff were with him. After a few minutes, he was escorted to the sitting room, and the house manager gave me a rundown of what had been going on. For the last 4 hours, James had been quite agitated and kept repeating the phrase, "Sarah, little girl," when asked what was wrong. This was something we had never experienced with him before, and the general conclusion was that he had seen something on TV or in a movie that stuck in his head and made him repeat this phrase. Once James had settled in bed, the night staff left, and the other member of staff that was sleeping in went up to the staff bedroom. I got on with my tasks and, as usual, finished around 1 a.m. Soon after this, I went upstairs to do a quick check on all the residents, but as I got on the first floor landing, I noticed the light had been turned off. There were 2 small corridors leading to the bedrooms on the left and right-hand sides of the staircase. James's room was on the left, and the light switch was just outside his room. I turned the corner to flick the switch, and there, in the darkness, in complete silence, was James. He stood in the corner, completely naked, with his eyes as wide as he could possibly hold them. I'm a big guy, 6'3" and weigh about 220 pounds, but at that moment, I was really creeped out. I spoke calmly to James and asked what was going on, and for a while, he said nothing at all. Then, as I turned the light back on, he let out an ear-piercing scream and started slapping himself around the face. The sleep-in staff woke up at this point and helped me to calm the situation and get James back into bed, before reassuring the other residents that everything was fine. After that night, I had 4 days off. My shift pattern was 7 days on, 2 days off, followed by 8 days on and 4 days off. And I was relieved that this incident had happened just as my time off began. I got back to work the following week and was told that the situation with James talking about the little girl had got a lot worse. He would spend hours staring out of the window that overlooked the garden saying, "Little girl, where are you, little girl?" And no one knew where he had heard the phrase. That night, around 3 a.m., the alarm went off to say that the door to room 5, the spare room, had been opened. Now, this instantly seemed a bit weird, as the door to the spare room is always kept locked because it was being used for storage at the time. I went up to investigate and found James standing in the room in the dark. He didn't seem to notice me entering and was just standing there whispering, "Where are you?" over and over again. I gently touched his shoulder and said something like, "Come on, mate, let's get you back to bed, it's late." James turned around and started heading back to his room, and for a second I was relieved. But then, as I locked the door to the spare room, he screamed, "Oh no!" and started pummeling the door with both fists. As he did this, the alarm went off to indicate that the front door had been opened. The only people with a key to the front door were myself, as the night wake staff, and the house manager. The door has 4 locks on it, 2 that require a key and 2 that require electronic ID cards. It was now 3:25 a.m. and the manager never came in before 8 a.m., so I presumed there must have been some kind of mistake and continued to defuse the situation with James. He finally calmed down and went back into his room, so I went downstairs to check the front door. To my surprise, it was wide open. I shut it immediately and started checking every room in the house in case someone had got in. I then checked on each of the residents to make sure they were all still in the house. Everything was fine. The next night, everything was calm until around 2 a.m. when one of the other residents, Connor, got up and said that someone was tapping on his window. I guess that he must have just been dreaming, as his window was on the 3rd floor of the house and was at least 25 feet from the ground. I went back up to his room with him to reassure him and checked his window. Sure enough, it was shut, and the security lock that prevents it from opening wide enough for someone to fit through, it was still sealed. As he got back in bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside of his room. He froze for a second and looked at me with an expression of pure panic on his face. I opened the door to see who it was, but no one was there. He was clearly scared by this and said, "Is he back?" My blood ran cold and I asked, "Is who back? What do you mean?" Connor looked over my shoulder and then sank down into his bed, pulling the duvet up to his mouth. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was still no one there. "Tell him to go away," Connor said in a hushed, scared voice. I tried to reassure him that there was no one there and left his bedside lamp on before leaving the room. I went downstairs and sat outside on the patio with a cup of coffee. It was the middle of January and around -2 outside, but it felt like I had to get out of the house for a while. After about 40 minutes, I went back inside and washed my cup in the sink, dried it, and put it back in the cupboard. Beneath the cupboard was a locked, secured drawer where all of the sharp knives are kept until needed. The drawer was open slightly. This was obviously a major issue, as none of the residents were allowed access to the knife drawer without supervision. I counted the knives and realized that there was one missing, so I woke the sleep-in staff, told her the situation, and we began a search. Nearly 2 hours later, we still hadn't found this missing knife, so decided to just keep our guard up and make sure none of the residents were hiding it. 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., the alarm sounded. It was the door to the spare room again. I went up to check it out and found that the door was locked. How could the alarm have been activated by the door opening if the door was still locked? I went inside and turned the light on. To this day, I still have no explanation for what I found, and I often think about this incident. The bed had been pushed from its usual place and was against the wall, and the wardrobe doors were open. There were screws and nails all over the floor, but nothing was broken. But the most disturbing part, in the middle of the room, there was a children's doll, a gold bracelet, and the missing knife from the kitchen. The doll was an old-style baby doll. My guess was that it was made in the 50s from the style of clothes and the overall look of the doll. The bracelet was simple but old-looking. I left everything as it was and reported it to the manager as soon as she arrived. No one ever claimed the bracelet belonged to them, and it was taken to a charity shop soon after, along with the doll. After the doll and bracelet were removed from the house, James seemed to calm down and never mentioned a little girl or stood around in the dark again. I still don't have an explanation for everything that happened, and sometimes think that it was just a combination of strange behavior from a young autistic guy and the fact that the house was old. But on the other hand, a lot of stuff happened that I can't explain logically. My only regret now is that the doll and bracelet are gone, and can't be examined or identified. Maybe it was paranormal. Who knows? But now, I work day shifts and do not plan on working night shifts again anytime soon. Thanks again for joining me for this compilation of narrations from the past few months. A special shout out to all my current subscribers and my new subscribers, and thank you to everyone watching. Did you enjoy this episode? If so, and you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell to know when the latest horror is available. Want to hear your true or fictional scary story narrated by me on this channel? Check the description below for more details. I'll see you in your nightmares. Good night.